My name is Lisa Schiltz. I'm the co-director of the Murphy Institute for Catholic Law, Thought, and Public Policy. It's a joint venture of the Center for Catholic Studies and the School of Law. This series that we have, Hot Topics and Cool Talks, has been presenting various contrasting disciplinary or religious views on contentious issues so that we can all shed some light into the types of things that often we are not able to talk about with cool heads. Today we have two wonderful speakers who are experts in the difficult topic that we're going to be addressing today, which is forgiveness and dealing with hate speech. We've had a series of talks this week at the law school on this topic, and this is a continuation of it that I think will be a highlight. We have from the School of Law, Professor Kahn, who has written extensively on Holocaust denial. He's written a book on Holocaust denial in the law, and has done an enormous amount of work on hate speech, including hate speech directed at Muslims, including the Danish cartoons, defamation of religion, cross-burning, and memory laws. It's currently working on a book-length manuscript on how history, culture, and geography make society more or less likely to punish hate speech. And then on a return engagement from our Department of Theology, we have Professor Kimberly Vrudny. She spoke on a related topic here at a Hot Topics program last year that was so superb that we basically spent most of our planning for this year trying to figure out another way to get her back here again. You'll see that Dr. Vrudny has had a lot of experience in the topics that we're going to be addressing today, not just academic, but also personal experience in the work that she has done and continues to do for the University of St. Thomas. She's been recognized for her peers in her excellence in teaching, receiving a Global Citizenship Award and the Faculty Award in Service Learning, and is now working, in addition to teaching, as Director of Civic Engagement for the University of St. Thomas. I don't want to take up any more of our time. Our program will be 12-minute presentations from Professor Kahn and then Dr. Rodney, then a few minutes of engagement by each of them, and then an opportunity to take questions from the floor. We ask that you put your questions on the little slips of paper, and then as the program goes on, our Murphy Fellows will be collecting them in order that we can sort out the questions and get the most efficiently to the two speakers during their question and answer session. So without any further ado, let me turn the program over to our first speaker, Professor Rob Kahn.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. It's a privilege to speak at the Hot Topics Cool Talk event on hate speech and forgiveness. I want to focus on three topics during the 12 or 13 minutes I have: hate speech, the internet, and forgiveness. And I'm going to want to say that the internet poses a dilemma for hate speech, and there is a certain aspect of forgiveness, a certain way of forgiving that may help point a way forward in a productive way. So let's start with hate speech. Hate speech is offensive speech. It can be based on race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, occupation, disability, a wide category of things. I want to focus on a common there are lots of arguments for and against hate speech. I want to focus on one of them. It's the argument, this is an argument against hate speech, that hate speech bans are a bad idea because they harm the very people they're meant to protect. And the classic story here is the United Kingdom, which in the 1960s passed the Race Relations Act, which was then used against Black Power activists. It's a story you ban hate speech, and it's used in a very broad way. in some ways, it's very similar to the Sherman Antitrust Act being used against labor unions. But I want to focus on a different type of issue, one related not to substance, not to the content of the speech, but to the process. And the argument here is about over-policing. Who enforces hate speech laws? The police. And I was having a discussion with Peter Molnar in Hungary, where he is a Hungarian human rights activist, very concerned about improving the status of the Roma people in Hungary. And the basic dilemma we were talking about is a society racist enough to require hate speech laws is also very likely to have racist police. Police who therefore may refuse to enforce hate speech laws or enforce the hate speech laws against the wrong person. And the fear here is, as I said, one of over-policing, especially among disadvantaged members of society. Okay, criminal sanctions are out from a United States perspective. That makes a fair amount of sense, I suppose. Let's talk about political correctness. If we don't punish hate speech legally, perhaps we can condemn it and declare that we have zero tolerance for hate speech. And this is a line that's taken by a variety of people, including Nadine Strawson, who was president of the American Civil Liberties Union. I want to suggest that there are some problems here as well. The first one is that more than one person can play this game. So in addition to shunning being something that you do on a college campus when you see hate speech, shunning is something that can be done to the people who are the shunners. So last semester, or in the spring of 2015, at the undergraduate campus, they were going to have hump day, and they wanted to bring a camel in. And a bunch of students objected to having the camel, in part because it spread stereotypes about Middle Eastern students, in part because there were some concerns about having a camel in Minnesota in March when it could be 30 degrees. And, that could be a story about, fighting bias. The problem is that this was reported and got national press in an article in the Atlantic Monthly about coddling the American mind. And basically what that article is trying to do is shun institutions like the University of St. Thomas, to say the University of St. Thomas is enforcing some type of political correctness, the type that they lampoon on South Park, even though the impetus came from the students. There were students who were opposed to this. And one of the things about efforts to shun is that the dominant culture will shun as well. And I'd say that, we live in a rampant culture of tattling, where it is very tempting to go to authority figures to show that there are violations of the rules. And to kind of give an example of this, I want to shift to the second topic, the internet. And I want to focus on a case that happened a year or two ago involving a computer convention. And at the computer convention, there are these two guys standing behind a woman. The guys tell a sexist joke. The woman turns around and snaps their photo, puts it on the internet, says, "This isn't an appropriate thing to do." And as a result, they get fired. Then the brushback from that comes back to the woman, who's then charged with violating the two males' rights, and she gets either fired or pressured. The point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that you get into this universe where everybody is telling on each other, and it's not healthy. The other thing about the internet is hate speech is everywhere. I'm Jewish, I can find a lot of very anti-Semitic things on the internet. There are a lot of racist things. There are a lot of sexist things on the internet. And it's tempting to want to be able to go after all of them. But in a practical sense, life is simply too short. You cannot police every single hateful comment you have in the internet. And if you ever see a story about a shooting or a crime or even a basketball game, and you go through the anonymous comments, you find incredibly racist things. You can spend your day reporting abuse, marking it as bad, but at a certain point, you're going to get tired. It's going to take up too much of your time. And lo and behold, if you get into a fight with one of these people who's probably using an assumed name, you just wind up in a situation that's impossible. You couldn't spend the entire day responding to it. And it's this dilemma about hate speech and about the internet and what it does that makes forgiveness very appealing, especially the idea of 70 times 7, that there are a potentially infinite number of arrows fired at you that you need to forgive or overlook. And let me talk about a couple of caveats and then talk about why I think this is a good idea. The first caveat is that forgiveness requires being in a place of safety. So that hate speech that directly incites to violence is different. Groups that are actively planning mass murder or criminal activities are different. Face-to-face hate speech could be different. Certain types of singling out. If what you're really talking about is terroristic threats that include a hate element, you can go after those. The second point is that one benefit of forgiving or overlooking certain types of hate speech is, or let me put it more as a caveat, forgiving and overlooking hate speech doesn't mean ignoring racism, sexism, or classism. It actually focuses on what's important. And let me just give a couple of examples. The Star Tribune had a recent poll about the Jamar Clark killing, and they talked about what people thought about the police. And 91% of Minnesotans think the police did a good job, but it's a lower number for the African American community and almost every white person in the poll. That's a problem. But I want to take a step back to a much bigger problem, which is that that poll only mentioned whites and African Americans, as if the only people who live in Minnesota are whites and African Americans. That's a problem with structural racism. That's a problem that doesn't relate to hate speech. And a lot of the focus on individual acts of hate speech take away from those types of issues. Let me make a couple other points about forgiveness. And here I draw on the work of Dr. Timothy Keller, a Presbyterian minister who's written a nice article, Serving Each Other Through Forgiveness and Reconciliation. I do not agree with everything Dr. Keller says, particularly on questions of marriage, equality, but what he says about forgiveness, I think is really on point. And it's that forgiving is hard, and forgiving is internal. Forgiving is about letting go. It's about taking the pain and putting it on your shoulders and not desiring revenge. Forgiving is different from rebuking. Rebuking is what you do. So you hate the sin and you love the sinner. Rebuking is about the sin. Rebuking is saying, once you've forgiven, you might go out and say, you shouldn't be doing this racist thing. But that has to come from a pure place in your heart, where you have already forgiven the person. And this is hard. It does not require an apology from the other side to, agree with Dr. Vrudny. It's not about reconciliation. It's about something you do. It's about a way you decide to be. And what I also really like about what Dr. Keller says is a couple other things about when you rebuke. And first point is that you wait for something serious. You don't necessarily rebuke the first time you see something that's negative. You don't necessarily, the first time you see racist hate speech, go after and complain. It's, do you see a pattern in this person that you are concerned about? Second, you don't tattle. If you're a bystander and you see something that you don't like, you can confront the person. What you don't do is turn around and go to the authority figure behind someone's back. That's not really a way to generate trust. And I think this is really important because a lot of the zero tolerance policies that are adopted, in the name of fighting racism, sexism, and so on, wind up being used against the very people who they are intended to protect, especially when you think about it in terms of public schools and some of the policies in states like Michigan where students can get suspended from school by using disrespectful language to teachers. That's something that may not be applied in a fair, even-handed way. And what you want to think about, and this will just be the final point, is on the one hand, when you pass a hate speech law, when you have a zero tolerance policy, when you, in a politically correct manner, go after everyone you see, you're wielding a club. And our society is too violent. Our society is not willing to connect with each other. It's not, again, to take another idea from Dr. Vrudny, it's not about reconciliation. It's not about restoring some great past, which is hard when the history itself was, founded on racism, sexism, that sort of thing. It's about conciliation. It's about trying to create friendship, trying to create connections, and to me that means forgiveness. It means forgiveness in appropriate situations. Not every time, all right, very last thing. The St. Paul police officer who wants to drive through Black Lives Matter protesters and has given that, ways to do this and not violate the law, that's not what I'm talking about. That's an issue to take very seriously. It's a police officer. It's a threat. By all means, let's investigate. But that's not the same thing as when you're in a chat room and you see someone say something that's offensive. It's not the same thing when you overhear someone say something that's offensive. In those situations where it's not a threat, you want to work with people, you want to understand, you want to forgive, and then decide, which is an internal thing, and then decide when, how, and if you want to communicate. Thanks very much. I look forward to the rest of the program.
Thank you, Robert. Kahn, it's always a joy when you come into a debate situation and realize you really agree with the one you're about to debate with. So takes the tension down a notch. Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to put some more details around this definition of forgiveness and go into a little bit more on the directive of Jesus about 70 times, 7 times. So I'm going to do that in a little bit of a different way. I'm going to focus on the Charleston massacre. Even on the same day that he would attend a Bible study at the historic Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Roof penned a manifesto expressing white supremacist views and posted it on a website he owned in which he called The Last Rhodesian, a reference to Zimbabwe under colonial rule. After about an hour, he took out a handgun and opened fire. He faces 33 federal charges, among them 9 counts of murder and 12 hate crime charges. These details might be lost in our memories of the incident last June because the conversation about this particular massacre, a reality that is now all too common in our country, was quickly overtaken by the actions of just a few of the victims' families when they appeared in court less than 48 hours later to attend Roof's bond hearing. Nadine Collier was the first who said through choked sobs, "I forgive you. You took something very precious away from me, but I forgive you." With those words, a new story emerged out of this atrocity, including the cover story for the November 23rd issue of Time magazine, in which Time's editor-at-large, David Vondrail, together with Joy Newton-Small and Maya Rodan, shares the stories of the 9 remarkable individuals who lost their lives that day, as well as the competing imaginations in Christianity, even within just one congregation, about what it means to forgive. Today, I want to enter into 2 of these imaginations as a means to explore Jesus' directive to forgive a wrongdoer 70 times, 7 times, and to consider this directive in the context of hate speech which in the case of Charleston was linked to murder. Whereas the first interpretive framework I will argue is dangerous, I believe that the second has liberating potential. One dominant view of forgiveness in the Christian theological imagination is like an acquittal, or a dropping of the charges against a wrongdoer. As Vondrail points out in his article for Time, for some, forgiveness speaks to the condition of the offender. Whatever was done wrong will be forgotten and all penalties erased. A debt can be forgiven, a crime can be pardoned, the slate is wiped clean, and the sinner writes a new future, unquote. For those of us raised in churches imbued with European sensibilities and the Western philosophical notions upon which they are built, particularly those rooted in an understanding of retributive styles of justice, this understanding is familiar, whether one is Roman Catholic or German Protestant. This view is doggedly logical. God is just. God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. God is also merciful, forgiving those who repent, even 70 times, 7 times, and so, therefore, must we. Back in that courtroom in Charleston, those who were shaped by this understanding of forgiveness were baffled when Nadine Collier offered forgiveness through tears. Forgiveness, according to this understanding, is typically understood to be equated with reconciliation, and it typically requires an action from the perpetrator, a confession, an apology, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, in order to make all things right again. However, since that apologetic action had not yet been forthcoming from Dylan Roof, we listened on the news to pundits suggest that forgiveness in this case came prematurely, even haphazardly, for it essentially acquitted Roof of the charges against him, at least on a metaphysical plane, in a one-off wiping of the slate. Without an apology, they said the extension of forgiveness might leave others vulnerable to Roof's violence, particularly if Nadine's posture were to be adopted by a jury in a court of law. But Vondrail goes on to outline the contours of an alternative imagination about the meaning of what it is to forgive. Rather than speaking to the condition of the offender, this one describes the state of mind of the forgiver. "You have harmed me, but I refuse to respond in kind," Vondrail wrote. Rather than wiping a slate clean, he goes on, "Forgiveness is a kind of purifier that absorbs injury and returns love. It's not really about the offender at all. There might be a hope attached that forgiveness will inspire a radical change for the better, but the offender is still culpable, still faces legal jeopardy, and ultimately still faces Judgment Day. For those raised in churches imbued with African sensibilities and the Ubuntu-inspired philosophical principles upon which they are based, and about which Desmond Tutu writes in his book No Future Without Forgiveness, this understanding is familiar, whether one is an African-born immigrant to this country or a descendant of those who were cruelly enslaved and brought to this country against their wills, which is but one of our country's original sins. This view is radically paradoxical. Rooted in restorative rather than retributive models of jurisprudence, God's justice is understood in a way that is not in opposition to God's mercy. Rather, God's justice desires reconciliation and the restoration of a relationship damaged by violation. Thus, God's justice is merciful, even forgiving the unrepentant soul 70 times, 7 times, and so too must we. Those shaped by this understanding of forgiveness were not surprised to hear Nadine Collier offer forgiveness through tears. The motivation operating behind this understanding of forgiveness is empowerment. Because the violator's wrongdoing was an expression of coercive power, a way of overpowering and controlling a victim, in this view, to withhold forgiveness until one hears an apology is to hand power over again to the perpetrator. However, to forgive is a way of saying, I'm taking my power back. I will not allow you to control me. I am letting go of vengeance. I am letting go of hatred so that I will not become who you are. In essence, Nadine Collier might have been saying, I will not allow you to hurt me further because I will not allow you to have power over me. And while it might appear like a one-off event, after all, she forgave him in that courtroom, I think that Jesus might be saying that one might need to forgive the same violation 70 times, 7 times. When anger and pain and thoughts of vengeance surface, as surely they must for Nadine Collier and for the others who expressed forgiveness that day, in that moment, when the powerful emotions surface, one practices a letting go, not in order to open oneself again to further abuse, but to regain one's power in a relationship gone terribly wrong. For in this view, forgiveness is not equivalent to reconciliation, as Robert Kahn said. This view recognizes that reconciliation can be a long and arduous process to restore mutual trust once a violation has occurred. Reconciliation will require an apology, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, something that an offer of forgiveness can sometimes elicit. Those of you with children might want to try this out. Forgiving first as a means of creating a space that is safe in which a child might apologize more naturally than when you just say you're sorry. But in an Ubuntu-inspired imagination, forgiveness and reconciliation are two very distinct moments on a sometimes long road to restored relationship. In the Gospel of Matthew, in a string of teachings about children being first in the kingdom of God and how God is like a shepherd who will leave 99 sheep to search for the lost one, that's a rather reckless shepherd, by the way, Jesus' disciple, Peter, approaches Jesus to ask if he should forgive a brother or a sister who sins against him even up to 7 times. 7 in the Hebrew tradition, I should say, is a number that signifies perfection or completeness. When Jesus answers, he says, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. The King James Version has our 70 times, 7 times. The idea, of course, is not that we forgive up until the 491st violation or even the 78th, but until forgiveness is perfectly complete, is the message. Indeed, I believe and very much hope that Jesus himself intended his directive to be interpreted more in the way of Africa than of Europe. For the European model is dangerous. If forgiveness requires an apology or a confession, it privileges the perpetrator. The violator maintains power in the relationship. Moreover, if forgiveness is a one-off event that is equivalent to reconciliation, it can open the victim to further abuse. In other words, the European model is dangerous because it empowers the perpetrator and makes the victim of violence vulnerable to experience it again and again. But if the African model is closer to Jesus's intention, and this makes some sense given the communal assumptions the Hebrew people shared with their African neighbors, If forgiveness is a means of empowerment for the one harmed, either directly or indirectly by a violation, power is reclaimed by the one against whom a violation has occurred. For in such a framework, the violated need not wait for an apology from the violator in order to let go. In such a view, forgiveness is about kenosis, the letting go of vengeance, violence, and hatred. And finally, if forgiveness is not a one-off event equivalent to reconciliation, but is a spiritual practice distinct from but potentially opening the way to reconciliation, the victim is not vulnerable to further abuse, for they will not be reconciled until the relationship is fully restored, which will require the transformation of the perpetrator and the healing of the relationship. What does all of this have to do with hate speech? If we believe that we must forgive a wrongdoer 70 times 7 times, and if we understand this in such a way that forgiveness is a one-off event that immediately acquits the one espousing hate and reconciles the two who are engaged in conflict, a viewpoint if nothing else, then to forgive incidents of hate speech is dangerous. It potentially masks rather than transforms the situation with a cheap, disingenuous, and confusing piety that only enables hate speech to perpetuate unchecked. However, if we believe that we must forgive a wrongdoer, even the one who speaks hatefully 70 times 7 times, understanding forgiveness not as a one-off event but as a spiritual discipline where one lets go of anger, resentment, and the desire for vengeance, and understanding forgiveness as distinct both from forgetting on the one hand and reconciling on the other, forgiveness is potentially liberative. Because hate speech is an attempt to manipulate and to control by elevating oneself precisely in the act of putting another down, if forgiveness is understood in the African framework I have been describing here, it undercuts the power of hate speech by exposing the violence and ugliness at its core, which is unveiled in sharp contrast to the love and the beauty in the kenotic expression of the one who offers forgiveness. In this sense, forgiveness itself is an act of resistance. It is a refusal to participate in the animosity out of which hate speech emanates in the first place. The remarkable thing to me in observing the stories that emerged out of Charleston on that tragic day is that these two imaginations are competing with one another, not only between continents, but even within that one African-American congregation most directly affected by this shooting and the hate speech that preceded it. Because of the European colonial influence of the American South in which Charleston is situated, it is not surprising to find elements of the Western theological imagination as it pertains to forgiveness in what, after all, is an American Methodist church. Perhaps what is more striking is that despite the violent abduction of people from African soil centuries ago and the battle for their freedom through our country's civil war, as well as through the ongoing segregation and inequalities that are slavery's legacy, the Ubuntu-inspired imagination still survives among some in that African-American community, where echoes of "we shall overcome" reverberate as the hope for deliverance continues to pass from generation to generation. Their incredible act of forgiveness circumvented an act designed to start a race war, and the Confederate flag finally fell. In saying this, I am mindful of South African novelist Alan Patton's famous line from his novel Cry the Beloved Country, which, if I could alter his words just slightly so as to imagine them spoken by a white woman, the lines would read, "I have one great fear in my heart, that one day, when we are finally turned to loving, we will find that they are turned to hating." But perhaps such an attitude is the thoroughly cynical view born too of a Western European mindset that finally cannot believe that there will not be retribution to pay for what people of my skin tone have done. Thank you. Suddenly there's a blank, Sean, of what we're supposed to do.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, dear.
Anybody has questions that they want to pose, please click on these and, put them up at our
I do have questions.
Okay, go ahead, and then I can figure.
So since we're not debating, but largely agreeing with one another, when I was preparing for this, I was trying to navigate the hate speech laws in our country and got really lost really fast. So I'm wondering, first of all, if you could just give us a quick primer, not for your law students out there, but for my theology students. And if you would, just by maybe revealing point of comparison, compare ours with the German laws that emerged after Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the tradition in Europe generally is much more restrictive of speech. So in Germany, there are laws that ban hate speech. They go back to earlier laws that would ban speech targeting professional groups, bankers, the police, the military. Most European countries restrict hate speech. In the United States, since the late 1960s, Brandenburg v. Ohio, the requirement is that you can only punish speech when there is direct call to imminent lawless action. There was a period where people thought this meant that you would never actually have hate speech laws in the United States, and that's the majority position, but there are little cracks and exceptions. Under Virginia v. Black, you can punish cross-burning when it's done with an intent to intimidate others. Several southern states have bans on Klan masks and paraphernalia. They get upheld in some instances, not in others. So in general, hate speech in the U.S. Is not allowed. On the other hand, when you go to Title VII, employment discrimination actions, hate speech can make up the basis of a hostile work environment claim. When you look about regulating television, same sorts of things. There are restrictions on what you can say and do, and there tends to be, in what I've said in other work, a regime of informal censorship. So when Howard Stern says something that he shouldn't, he will be discouraged or kicked off the airwaves for a while. But so there's some, but I mean, in general, the imaginary is one of tolerating it. Let me ask you a question about Charleston and kind of play devil's advocate, I guess. The thing that, to me, I'll put it a different way, it's easy on one level to forgive speech, and I appreciate the argument about empowering the person in question, but there's something about the nature of the act of violence. On one level, I'm just kind of in awe that you can do this. And let me just relate a personal event. When I lived in Baltimore, my wife and I were walking home to the dorm at 3 a.m. and we were mugged at gunpoint. It was not an enjoyable experience. It led to a lot of unhappy thoughts. This was a big thing in Baltimore at the time. There was someone in the sociology department who was mugged at gunpoint as well around the same time, and her response was to work in a soup kitchen. She saw a connection between the economic motivations that were, making it a tempting thing to, go after students who were walking around at 3 a.m. or as a student, then she was faculty member, and what restoration meant. And I guess I was just wondering, based on your own experience, if you had a sense of what are the personal qualities that enable someone to take that step, to be able to let go within 48 hours.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it also gets at the level of motivation too, because I think one thing that you might all be sitting there thinking about is, well, in both imaginations, the European one and the African one, they're both forgiving, and we don't really know what's going on inside of the person that's motivating it. And so at one level, what I want to say is that this would require sort of a shift of enculturation. So in the Christian milieu, most of the seminaries in the country are still dominated by the European model, and will be sharing with their seminarians the European model, which is taught to the lay people, and so it continues. It's an enculturation process. But if those seminaries were to be exposed more often to the liberation theologies of South Africa and of civil rights era America, Latin America too, was dealing with these questions of forgiveness, then those might seep into the structure of how we train priests and so on. And those ideas would then become more enculturated over time, in which case then this instinct perhaps might be more at the ready than it currently is in the Christian, I think, theological imagination dominant in America.
I mean, let me just add that to me, looking at the internet, one of the things I see is that European retribution-based model really being problematic, because you're looking at things, you're seeing, how can they say that? And you're saying, yeah, we have to go after that. And it's the idea that, all right, I see this on the internet, I don't like it, I need to find a way to not reconcile with the person, but, you know, forgive, overlook, move on, accept that that person may be going through things that I don't understand. But how would you say we should go about making those changes? Or is it something that should be conducted primarily within theology seminaries, or is it something that is, are there other ways of going about?
Accessible to everyone in the in the culture. You know, I don't know what to say except maybe to point to a couple of examples where this is becoming more dominantly in the imagination, I think, publicly. So I don't know how many of you have seen the film The Interpreter. Have you seen the film The Interpreter? There's a violent scene at the beginning of this where there is a man who is shot outside of a stadium, and it's set in Africa, and there's a genocide that's occurred, and bodies of the dead are about to be discovered in the stadium. And there's a young boy who has a gun, and he shoots the man outside of the stadium, and as the man is falling to the ground, he says, "I forgive you. I forgive you." So what conditions, you're asking, what conditions are going to be in place for someone to say, "I forgive you," as he's falling to the ground? And I think that when you're talking about understanding structural conditions, it's another key piece of this. The reason we find out in the film that he's able to say it is because he understands what has caused this young boy to hate and to possess a gun in the first place. And he recognizes it in its larger context, and he's able to forgive. In the same way, the Catholic nun who, after the Dutch cartoon circulates, there's a Catholic nun who's shot, and as she's falling to the ground, she says to the person who's shot her, "I forgive you." She recognizes the hate that has gone into creating that moment.
Well, I think I'll start with some of the questions from the audience. The first two really just picking up and continuing the conversation that you two already raised in your questions to one another, but maybe we can add a little more to them. One of them was for either, what do we need to do here in America to work towards a more Ubuntu approach of forgiveness in terms of hate speech? And you've given your prescription, which is to try to get it into the imagination, working through seminaries, presumably of different religions. So I would like to see what Rob, as the lawyer dealing with the policy, thinks of that. And then related is this question here. It's the same question, but maybe there's some more things we could add to the discussion. How do you see the theological weight of forgiveness coming into the public policy discussions? So how do you make that transition into public policy, especially when the trend is to evade Christian morality when justifying policy, at least here in the United States?
Let me take up the legal question, and then we can talk about the theology. I guess, to me, Can you actually repeat the first part of the question?
There
I'm
was a
sorry.
lot in there.
The first question was, what do we need to do here in America to work towards a more Ubuntu approach of forgiveness in terms of hate speech? And Dr. Vrudny has told us where she thinks it needs to begin in the seminaries and
In my little
to
world.
seep its way into the dialogue
Okay,
of all the believers who are learning a new way of thinking about this from their religious leaders, presumably. And then the question that I have is then and the question that this questioner had is how does it then leap into public policy, especially when there's this trend to keep religion out of public policy discussions?
Okay, there's law, and law is scary. There's an article in the New York Times, it's well worth reading, about hate speech laws in Spain and the way they're being used very, very broadly. So talking about law in this context could be counterproductive. What would be very productive is this discussion of political correctness, informal censorship, and how you condemn. So if there's, you're the president of the university and something happens at the university, you need to say something about that. You need to, condemn the act. But at the same time, you need to look at the people involved. There is a case at the University of Arizona involving a misguided teaching assistant who, in like 1996, 97, decided the way to teach freshman comp was to give 10 pages of unedited hate speech to the students and have them react to it. And there had been a lot of set of issues on campus about this sort of, there'd been racial issues with the campus frat, and the initial impulse was to just vilify this teaching assistant and to say that, she was horrible. And what they found is that she was actually inexperienced. It was a very bad thing to do. And instead of it being about whether the teaching assistant should be dismissed, it was about having more training, more education for the teaching assistants. She got to stay. She got it was part of her teaching evaluation process that she did something that didn't go over that well. But that's possible by forgiving her first. And then instead of saying, I have this unrequited anger in me and I need to get rid of her, I need to fire her, I need to dismiss her, make an example of her. Same thing with the fraternity people who had the racist chants that were picked up. What's interesting about some of these informal sanctions is they tend to be, you suspend people, you kick them out of school, and maybe what they just need to do is to be taught not to do that again. And part of that forgiveness then is really about policy. At my son's public school, it's illegal to name your iPad, which they've now distributed to all the students, against a teacher. You can't, or name it after a teacher. I guess they think after is against. And again, it's the idea that when you find someone who's done that, are you thinking about it in terms of a retributive model that you violated this informal, non-legal rule but still has consequences? Or do you ask and say, what's motivated this person, what's going on? Why did, the examples that Dr. Vrudny made, if people who are falling to the ground can say, I forgive you, and can say, what is it that brought this person here? I think that we could do that as well with instances of hate speech and say, what is it that motivates people, even if there are still consequences at the end?
Want me to take it up too? I think that maybe one way to get this into the Western imagination, both in terms of theology and jurisprudence, is to follow some African leaders, to invite them to the table. I mean, one of the ways that this is happening. The discussion is happening. I mean, look at us here. We're breaking it open right here at the University of St. Thomas. But this discussion was very much on the table for weeks, last June and July, right? Every time you turned on the news, there it was. And part of my frustration in watching the conversation as it unfolded in those weeks is the echo chamber that you started to hear, and that no one was really penetrating to these deeper insights, whether it was on MSNBC or Fox. Both were struggling, and that's because there were, as far as I could tell, very few African American leaders who were actually called to the table to discuss what is informing folks like Nadine Collier's imagination. So that's one thing. Restorative models are also making their way, it seems to me, into the system. Certainly, you know more about this than I do, but it seems to me to be a lot of talk in law schools these days about, especially in the criminal justice system, and the disparities that we have in numbers of African Americans in the prison system, disproportionately high. It seems that there's a lot of talk of restorative models of atonement, restorative models of jurisprudence, and how do we implement those models in a system that was really designed in a retributive way. So those are at least bright spots on the horizon of where the conversation seems to be trying to push us in a little bit of a different way.
Okay. Next question is for Dr. Vrudny. Is it too broad a brush to say that all Western philosophy views forgiveness as an acquittal? While this is the predominant view, prominent Western philosophers like John Paul II, who openly embrace what you have deemed to be an Ubuntu exclusive form of forgiveness.
I had 12 minutes. You're absolutely right, whoever wrote that.
Okay, then Professor Kahn. In discussing the danger of over-policing of hate speech laws, you said a society racist enough to need hate speech laws is likely to have racist police. Is there a society anywhere that is so non-racist that it doesn't need hate speech laws? Isn't the fact that a society can get enough consensus to get a hate speech law enacted an indication that there's general consensus that is not racist? Why assume the police are more racist than the majority that got the law passed?
Part of the question there depends on what motivates the passage of the hate speech law. It could be, on the one hand, that you pass the hate speech law because society as a whole is non-racist and wants to show that they're, morally superior. In fact, or it could be that you actually have a problem with racism, and I'm not saying that the police would necessarily be more racist than the rest of the society, but that the police may be as racist as the rest of the society, and that and they're part of, to add a kind of dark spot to balance the, bright spot about, restorative models of criminal justice, is we've seen in Ferguson a model of policing where petty crimes, loitering, jaywalking are disproportionately targeting African Americans and people of color. We have models of police departments in southern states that basically view petty crimes as a way of generating revenue for the police department. I don't want to necessarily argue about what individual police officers do. I want to counsel skepticism about the idea that bringing the police officer to enforce a speech offense is always going to be a good thing. One of the other things I'd say, and you see this in, all right, why do states like Virginia and Georgia pass anti-Klan laws in like the 40s and 50s? Is it because they're genuinely non-racist, or is it because the more moderate supporters of segregation are embarrassed by the Klan? This is something that Justice Clarence Thomas wrote about in his dissenting opinion in Virginia v. Black. There's really, so it could be that you have other motivations for passing the laws, but my main concern, to bring it back more broadly to forgiveness, is that it's really about society in general, and it's about the police are necessary. What the police do in society, is apprehend people who violate the law. It is an impossible job. You need to have them. But the more you expand what the police do, and the more obligations you give them, I mean, think about the person who was strangled to death by the police in New York City, Eric Garner. He was killed because he was running a unregistered lottery scheme. You want to ask yourself about burdens that you put on policing and about this kind of club of retribution and what it does to society as a whole, and whether it's John Paul II or the Ubuntu model, looking at society in a different way. I mean, you can look at it also as Durkheim going from mechanical solidarity to organic solidarity, where it's more about people relating to each other. And it's keeping the policing to a minimum, a necessary minimum, but a minimum.
Yeah, I think we have time for just one more, and maybe this will be a practical way to end. From both of you, this was directed to either, what can we do to address hate speech on social media without merely saying you are a bad person, or by returning saying hateful things?
Yeah, I think probably modeling. I think that all of us say things from time to time that we regret or that we just don't know better. And if it's in that category, it takes someone to have the courage to point it out to us. In which case you could say, but when I hear you say that, this is what it makes me think. And then it's not so confrontational, but you can still have a relationship with this person afterwards instead of just cutting yourselves off. That's one way, but again, that's not in an example where we're about to incite some hateful violence afterwards. But just when persons say things that are not well informed.
I think it depends on the circumstance. Certainly there are situations where you can report abuse when you're not directly involved, but I also think part of it is if you're in a listserv or something where people are having a big fight about something, they're having a flame war with racial overtones, you can change the subject. You can say, how about those Timberwolves? Sometimes just changing the nature of the conversation, saying, okay, let's move on to something else, can short circuit what's going on. The other thing is when you know people who have things on their Facebook pages that are hateful, a little reminder that, remember, this is a record. People are looking at your Facebook site for a lot of different reasons, and when you link to, some sort of hate speech, think about the consequences of that. But the most important thing is when you see something, understand the context, understand that this might, it's kind of this overlooking, it's this forgiving, saying, I mean, my relative has a lot of, anti-Muslim hate speech on her Facebook page. I still talk to my relative. I try to counsel her not to do it, but we have other issues that we talk about long before that, but it's looking at those moments and seeing if you can connect in a way that's non-judgmental, but just, you sure you wanted to have that one there? It's not a great answer, but, it's a really important issue.
I think both of you are being too modest. Those were great answers to very difficult questions. And just having the cerebral framework or the intellectual framework that both of you have offered to think through some of these difficult things is going to be really helpful for all of us. in trying to come up with our practical, personal responses as to how to influence the world to think more broadly about the issues than sometimes we see in media. So please join me in thanking our two speakers today for the treasure and the gift of